researcher and as a writer. He has written multiple books about our area's history, very well connected to our story here at Raynham Hall, so we're super excited to have him here. He will be speaking primarily about his most recent book, which is Chronicles of the British Occupation of Long Island, and we're very excited to have you here, David, and thank you for speaking with us.
Actually, I'm going to see if I can try to talk without the microphone, and then you guys yell at me if I'm not loud enough, okay? Louder? All right, before we begin, can everyone hear?
So far.
Okay. Yeah, my voice may go, and then we'll have to. Before I begin, I have to apologize. I haven't given a presentation for 3-4 years, probably before COVID. So everyone be gentle. You know, I'm a little nervous because we got the militia. I may get a musket ball thrown at me today. So when I was researching and writing the book Lost British Forts of Long Island. So this, actually, thank you for the many book compliment, but I actually wrote 2 books. You know, and I do write for the Journal of the American Revolution, an online journal, and there's a number of stories about Long Island on there. So when I wrote this first book, I came upon a number of stories describing the experiences of the people living during the years of the British occupation on Long Island. Hello, Patrick. Thanks for joining. In time, this collection of pieces became large enough that I began to envision a narrative about these people and their experiences during the war. This was to become the foundation. So the research from this book led to the beginnings of the foundation for the book Chronicles of the British Occupation of Long Island, which I'm talking a little bit more about today. I noticed in my research for this that most histories that covered the occupation were lacking a personal or people side to their telling. It was my goal in writing Chronicles to touch on what it was like to live within the time of the British occupation for both the inhabitants and the military forces. Also, in putting together the book, I came upon a diary titled Personal Recollections of the American Revolution, a private journal, written by Lydia Minturn Post. Set in the period of the British occupation and on Long Island, it gave a glimpse into the time by telling a number of stories from the period of people living at the time. It even told the opinions of people and about what was happening around them. The book, known actually as a work of fiction, at least in my mind, was considered a primary source based on some unknown period diaries. The author knows a little bit too much about the time in detail. Likewise, the artist Alfred Wordsworth Thompson, also of the 19th century, successfully gives portrayals of life during the occupation in his paintings. Both Halt at the Outpost, actually I have a blow up here. I don't have a lot of visuals, so I'm showing you a couple of key pieces, which is actually featured on the cover of my first book. And another painting by him called Advance of the Enemy was also featured on Chronicles of the British occupation. So, together the two books hope to portray through a visual a strong accent for what the book was going to be about. The works show a dark and forbidding landscape, one of subjugation by a conquering army in a time of war. I wanted my talk today to include a reading from each chapter of my book. My hope is for the audience to hear a little of the experiences of this time. Long Island was engulfed in a harsh civil war. Loyalists were set against Patriots. Many were seeking revenge and retribution due to exile. All were being subject to the vicious British Army. The book chapters were based on themes, words that would have been common vocabulary from the time. So to begin with, I'm going to read of two different proclamations by two different British generals who wrote this in 1776, just after winning the Battle of Long Island. General William Howe, the conquering commander of the region, in a proclamation on August 23rd, 1776, offered pardon and protection to the loyal inhabitants of Long Island, who had been forced into rebellion, and he gave encouragement to those who chose to take up arms for the restoration of order and good government within the island. Brigadier General William Erskine's proclamation on August 29th, a little later, 1776, called upon the inhabitants of Suffolk County to lay down their arms and provide the troops with cattle, wagons, and horses. If they failed to show a dutiful submission to all respects, Erskine warned he would march his troops without delay into the country and lay waste the property of the disobedient as persons unworthy of His Majesty's clemency. So this is from the chapter Quartering. After Long Island was occupied by the British, the act of billeting troops became necessary due to the size of the forces needed to reside in the area. In this changing dynamic, the Whigs, who had supported independence and remained on the island, were at great risk of their property being taken and their homes and resources being confiscated for use by the British. Henry Underdog Jr. illustrates the act of billeting British soldiers on Long Island at the time. During the summer, British troops were off island on active service, or if a few remained here, they abode under tents, but in winter they were huddled on the sunny side of a hill, or else distributed in farmers' houses. A British officer, accompanied by a justice of the peace or some prominent loyalist as a guide, rode around the country and from actual inspection decided how many soldiers each house could receive, and this number was chalked on the door. The only notification was, "Madam, we have come to take a billet on your house. If a house had but one fireplace, it was passed by, as the soldiers were not intended to form part of the family. A double house for the officers or a single house with a kitchen for the privates was just the thing. The soldiers were quartered in the kitchen and the inner door nailed shut, so the soldiers could not intrude on the household. They, however, often became intimate with the family and sometimes intermarried. Okay, so this is in the chapter Requisition. These are orders to a Captain Daniel Youngs, captain of the Queen's County Militia, from the British command. In those districts in which any troops are hutted, the inhabitants, by the direction of the captain of militia, to cart the wood to the common wood yard, and to unload as ordered by the barrack master or quartermaster of the regiment in his absence. But where the troops are cantoned or billeted on the inhabitants, the captains of militia, so to regulate the matter that each inhabitant may supply the nearest fire, the whole in the district nevertheless to bear an equal proportion in the quantity requisite by assessment. Plundering, chapter 3. Plundering was outside the rules of the requisitioning system and was outright stealing done by the troops, usually those lower down in the ranks. And here's a story. A family living a mile from us were quietly sitting together in the evening when a noise was heard on the door like that of a sharp instrument thrust into it. On opening the door, there stood a redcoat with his saber in his hand, which he had struck into the wood an inch or two. He was backed by a dozen men. They pushed their way in and were very unruly, rummaging and ransacking every drawer and closet. But the family had long taken the precaution to place all their valuables and money in a small room which opened out of the common sitting room, putting a large cupboard before the door, which was covered so entirely so that the Hessians quartered there last winter never discovered the existence of the room. A cunning device, the redcoats, highly enraged at finding nothing, began to threaten terrible things if they did not divulge the hiding place. Sorry, they're kind of long readings. I'm sorry. So this is abuses. The chapter abuses. If you haven't heard this, you may find this interesting. This is actually took place in Jericho, not far from here. A number of horsemen of the 16th and 17th Regiment of Dragoons being quartered in the neighborhood of Jericho, Long Island. Some of the men charged one of the inhabitants, a blacksmith by trade, named Jacob Williams, with welding his own tongs together to prevent their being used by them. But even this charge was destitute of truth. The fact was that the smiths, farriers, they actually worked for the cavalry, which belonged to the troops, had worked them up into horseshoes for their own horses. For the above alleged offense, without an investigation, one of the captains ordered that Williams should be picketed. Accordingly, he was immediately taken into Elias Hicks' orchard, where his right hand and left leg being first tied together behind him, he was suspended by the wrist of the other arm with a cord to the limb of an apple tree, without anything to rest his right bare foot on but a peg of hardwood placed in the ground under him, merely as an aggravation, the upper end being so sharp that he could bear no weight on it. In this manner he was kept till he fainted. He was then let down, but not before nature had so far exhausted him that it was sometime doubtful whether he would be restored to life. He at length, however, revived and was discharged. That was to an inhabitant of the island. This is from the chapter Dragoons. The Post Diary, this is the book, the narrative I mentioned at the beginning, written by the woman on Long Island. The Post Diary tells of a robbery in 1780 in which the attackers wore black masks and were armed with cutlasses and silvered pistols. They broke into the house of a person named Joseph Willet, who was of some age. They inquired about the location of his money, and after he offered only his timepiece, they became enraged. One of the robbers struck the old man with his cutlass, and as he stooped to avoid the blow, he was hit severely on the cheek. The diary later describes that a report of the attack was made to the captain of a company of troops quartered at Jericho. 3 men of the unit were found to have been absent on the night of the attack. The men were recognized by members of the household where the attack took place. Mr. Willet personally pleaded for the guilty man to not be dealt with severely. The men, however, were dealt with severely by what they called picketing. It's more than likely that the culprits were troopers of the 17th Light Dragoons. This is in the chapter Hessians, chapter 6. This is a quote. The ravages committed by the Hessians and all ranks of the army on the poor inhabitants of the country make their case deplorable. The Hessians destroy all the fruits of the earth without regard to loyalists or rebels, the property of both being equally prey to them, in which our troops are too ready to follow their example, and are too much licensed to it. The Hessian had a towering brass-fronted cap. Some had 3-cornered hats, mustachios colored with the same material that colored his shoes, which were square-toed, turned up, and had large buckles. His hair plastered with tallow and flour, and tightly drawn into a long queue reaching to his waist. A blue uniform almost covered by broad belts that sustained his cartouche box. His brass hilted sword and his bayonet, a yellow waistcoat with flaps, and yellow breeches met at the knee by black gaiters. And in the book I have an illustration of a Hessian that kind of portrays that. Chapter 9, Raiders. Stories also in the Lydia Post Diary record a number of assaults on inhabitants of Long Island. So this is of a person living, a woman living at the time. So it's a little dramatic, but worse than all, robbers come over from the main shore in boats and keep us in constant alarm. They belong to no party and spare none. Freebooters, cowardly midnight assassins, incendiaries, indiscriminate, bold, and daring. Their right hand is against every man, and every man's hand is against them. Chapter on Quakers. Joseph Willet of Westbury was robbed of 30 or 40 pounds by some soldiers who lay at Jericho. They maltreated him with a view of extorting more money, till his sister Sarah rushed in to avert the blows from her brother, saying, "You will not strike an unarmed woman." On his making complaint to the authorities, the soldiers were drawn up in 2 rows, and he was ordered to walk between and point out the robbers. But the conscientious and humane Quaker relented and told the officers he could not identify them with sufficient accuracy to have them punished, so they were released. And finally, the last chapter, Refugees. The story of Captain Paul Reeve of Aquabog, it's on the North Shore, the North Fork of Long Island, further out. He's of Aquabog, tells how he had served with Colonel Josiah Smith's regiment and had to flee with his wife and 5 children to Saybrook, Connecticut. He took as many possessions as he could, including 1 yoke of oxen, 8 cows, 1 2-year-old steer, 1 horse, and 18 sheep. Not long after his flight, he had to petition the governor of Connecticut to allow him to return to his Long Island estate to get more of his possessions. While he was away on refuge, his horse and 6 of his cows died, and he had to sell the oxen away to support his family. His petition for returning was refused, but he was given a job conveying refugees from Saybrook to Dutchess County, New York. So I wanted to just read those to give you a little bit of flavor of the time, and we're gonna have questions. So, I think you have to kind of gather your own conclusions by a lot of those passages. But I was going to talk about one specific, and with questions I can talk a little more freely too. I wanted to get through somewhat of a script. I wanted to talk a little bit about the first book, Lost British Forts of Long Island. Harriet had asked me to mention a little bit about the book, and I did want everyone to, if you haven't seen the model inside here of Oyster Bay, done by Richard Schuster of Raymond Hall, sitting over here. We met early on, and we did do a little consultation on the fort, what it would have looked like, etc. And it's a very good replication of the village. It really brings to life the period. What I wanted to give everyone a little bit more of a heads up is a position in Jericho that was a British position in the occupation that was very similar to Oyster Bay, and had a lot of the same forces frequented it. Jericho, 6 miles directly south of us. It was a crossroads. It was actually quite a large town, like Oyster Bay, and at the crossroads, it was a strategic point to place a fortification, but it was also it was open to the Hempstead Plains. So it was an ideal spot for the cavalry to be quartered. People love to hear this. If you don't know, it's in my book. The post was called Fort Nonsense. Everyone's going to ask me, what does that mean? And I can. So if someone asks me, I'll tell you, or try to tell you, because it's hard and not solved. But this is a map I did in the first book that shows the crossroads of Jericho. So anybody who comes from the south has gone through Jericho, but it doesn't look at all like this anymore. It was a very old country road that went through the center, and that road's been cut in half. They built a clover leaf kind of in the middle, like about here in this map. So it's all broke up, and the history's really fallen apart, and as everyone knows, it's been highly developed there. Luckily, this is the Jericho Preserve, where this house, the Malcolm House, is today, and this was the property of Dr. James Townsend. He was the brother, actually, of Samuel Townsend of Raynham Hall. This property was the estate of the Townsends before Samuel. The family came, the father before Jacob lived in this property, which is so today, today this is 106, the main, 106 goes through here, but the main road that was going to Oyster Bay went north-south. And this is Jericho Turnpike at the time, where it started. And so the clover leaf today, you pass by all this, but if you know the Quaker meeting house is right here. And so this house is still here. The back portion is probably, from what we can tell, Revolutionary period. So that may have been the part or the house of Dr. James Townsend. It may have been moved. I'm actually thinking it moved a couple times, rotated, whatever. But the British Legion and the Queen's Rangers, Simcoe was there, Tarleton, Bannister Tarleton, everyone's heard of, was there with the Legion. And the doctor's house was taken over as the headquarters. But it was a little different than Raynham Hall. The British, the story is that they had built a fort around the house. So it was a fortification, but a fortified house. And my map portrays what that possibly was. And there is notes through history that there was possibly a barn. We know the barn was there. We don't know where exactly. But if it was very close, which a lot of them were at the time, probably it was fortified too, and it was kind of like a fortified encampment for the British Legion. So this history is not well known. So this is the position they called Fort Nonsense. Probably the speculation is it has something to do with the Quakers. It was a Quaker town, and they were peaceful, and they just saw it was nonsense to have a fort there because there was no threat to anybody or to the British. So, so that site is there, and it's in the preserve, and these houses still here, and it's rented out it's owned by Nassau County, thank God, and that's good or bad, but thank God that somebody is in the ownership of somebody that from the municipality. So it's rented out, and a lot of people don't know the history. So we've done archaeological studies there. The Cedar Swamp Historical Society, Steve Warner over here has helped me collaborate. Put your hand up, Steve. Has helped on some of those collaborations. We did metal detecting studies. I have some of those artifacts here. There aren't many from the British, although in the last 2 years I have found British pieces from the British military. Neck buckles, things like that. But they're very spotty. The ground has changed a lot. Um, so anyway, in long term, I see potentially a museum there. You know, I may be involved with it. You know, I'm always looking if anybody has an interest to collaborate or donate to such a thing, maybe a possible museum of the American Revolution in the next few years, especially with the anniversary coming up of the independence, 250th independence. So, this is a little bit of a diagram of what a fortified house was. Probably there was earthworks around the buildings, defenses, and if you look at that model, you can inside you can sort of see what that might have looked like. But we're trying to gather information. We've also done studies down at the Quaker Meeting House, where I mentioned on my map. I speculated that this might have been a major encampment. It was pretty flat. This is the highest ground, although it's pretty flat there. This is the highest ground in Jericho at this meeting road. And I started to find camp artifacts here on the Quaker meeting ground as well. And I have some of those here too. So that is the story. There was one more thing I wanted to mention. I'll let it go from there. So anyway, was there any questions from anybody?
The Underhill Farm that was where Bristol Assisted Living Facility is now.
Right.
Did you have a chance to look over there before they demolished it?
I've actually looked over there somewhat because it's not before that happened because it was private and very separated. And I had just been starting this kind of research on this in 2017, maybe actually a little earlier, 2015. So we never got to organize a real dig or whatever, but I have gone back. The preserve is still there. It's just so terribly overgrown. It's tough to get in. You know, there was speculation that that was the position of the fort there. And there was a hill there that was demoed, and they built that subdivision right before that home facility. So, yeah, no, but...
Are there other sites around there that you would like to go see before they get transformed?
Well, there's not much left to look anywhere. Really all over the present property of... Yeah, this year I'd like to focus a little bit of study across this road, which is part of this preserve. But it's so heavily overgrown, it's tough to get in there. But I did find some artifacts right at the meeting point of these two roads. So they were encamped there. So they had some sort of position. So I'm imagining over here, they may have also encamped. So Fort Nonsense is very difficult because there's just not the artifacts and the history. It's only written of in one primary source, which I found, which was an order of it being the house was fortified, and it was from the American side, and it was a kind of a spy reporting, and the other was done in the 19th century with Henry Underdog. Was talking to the locals, and they talked about Fort Nonsense. So, you know, one of the things, and I found it even in the second book, is that it's so hard to get information. But I think that the army, the British military, like the Americans, were trying to hide as much as they could. So they were very careful about writing things down. You know, this position had that, this position had that. So you find very little. I mean, we find a couple things about Oyster Bay here from Simcoe, the British, but it's years after. There's nothing that says Jericho. But we know that thousands of troops were going through Jericho because it's the main road to New York. And anyway, I forgot to mention, so one of the things is I'm working, if you start to begin to even think of a museum there, you need to get grants. And so I'm working right now to get it on the National Registry of Historic Spaces. I got permission from Nassau County to at least, it'll be recognized as Dr. James Townsend, Patriot. He was a Patriot and a member of a Congress and the provincial associations. I mean, he was up there, and he was, you know, a strong patriot like all the Townsends.
Is the name you mentioned, is it Underdog or Underdog?
Underdog.
Underdog from the Manhassan, because that's the same family.
Yep, the old family, it goes back, yeah. But he was writing in the mid-1800s, and he was interviewing people from the time.
That house, there's a house there that's still...
The Underdog house?
The Underdog house is still...
Yeah, and I think that is from his family way back.
Yeah.
Right, Dutch family. Richard.
Thank you, David. First of all, I want to say I've read both books, and I think they're really worth reading. It's wonderful to finally find out what Long Islanders were doing during the Revolution. We didn't learn about that in school. We learned about, you know, Boston and all the major battles. So a question I have, based on your research, when I was doing research on the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, when the British came over from Staten Island to invade Long Island, many of the officers, I found letters that they wrote back to their relatives that Long Island was an extremely prosperous community. Beautiful houses, livestock, gardens, apple orchards, and they couldn't understand why these people wanted to rebel against their mother country, Great Britain, because they were living so well. As a matter of fact, I believe the colonies had one of the highest standards of living in the world at that time. Did you find any research on that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a quote. I mean, you'd have to get the book, but the Hessians talk about what a beautiful island. Everybody's prosperous, and all the land has this great potential, and this and that. And yeah, they couldn't understand it either. You know, a lot of them were loyal, especially where we are here. You know, I mean, I don't want to pinpoint, and I don't want you to quote this, but you know, we're looking 80 to 90% of the population in Oyster Bay were for the British and loyal, and the best land, and the closer you got to New York City, and you know, those were the people who were loyalists, and you know, the people. This is interesting, Richard. You'll like this, and I always want to I want to write more about the Loyalists here, because you know, they're really an underdog today. You know, they're forgotten here because I just had an interview. I was telling Harriet with Newsday there's going to be a special on my book, but I was talking with the author, and you know, a lot of people, I think, would be amazed to know that probably half of their family at the time was Loyalist and Patriot, and you know, especially on Long Island. Where was I going with this, Richard? So what I have been finding is Loyalists that actually went to Canada found it so harsh and unpleasant that they figured out whatever they could to get back here and to go undercover and acclimate themselves, shut their mouths. You know, they were kind of wanted. And the other discovery of the book I talk about at the end is how well, if you gather one thing from my lecture, you know, you'll learn this today. It's amazing how well the people of Long Island knew what persuasion their politics were. You know, they knew, you know, that's a Loyalist there, that's a Patriot there. and then I started to, and then I'm doing another article right now on billeting for the Journal of the American Revolution. And I found another journal from the time of a lady in Philadelphia. Her last name was Drinker. And she was talking about the officers quartering. It was really, the records are coming down through the women of the time in the household about these private matters of living in a house and dealing with the British occupation, because Philadelphia was occupied. What was I? So they sit around, and what I always found is they're all sitting around having tea at, a couple times a day, and they'd invite everybody. And the British officer would join if he was quartering with them. And so, and they talk about the gossip. This neighbor over here got attacked, this person. And sometimes stories, I'm sure, snowballed. But it's interesting stuff. So I think that the word of mouth was passing through the female persuasion even more than the male, and everybody knew your political side. Any other comments, questions? Patrick, go.
In your new book, the passage about the soldier knocking on the door with the saber and whatnot, and coming in to have the secret room, where was that account from? Do you remember what?
And I go into detail. I'm not going to go into, I talk a lot about Hempstead became the headquarters of the 17th Light Dragoons. The Dragoons were in Oyster Bay, they were in Jericho, they were wherever the land flattened out and they could get out to forage on the plains, or they would go foraging to the end of Long Island. Here, I can actually find it pretty easily. So, and this is a make-believe story, but I think it was based.
No, did it come from
the diary?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what
Joseph Willet, and she actually used names, like her last name was Post, and I talk about it in the book at the beginning. There actually was a Henry Post, and his house is in Westbury, and it quartered Hessians. This has all been documented, and I've been researching it. So this writer was changing names of people, but she was documenting what was going on.
I just think I think it's so interesting because
quartered at Jericho, but we don't know where that took place. Joseph? Yeah, I don't know. And most of her story is about Quakers. So we know the Quakers, we can track them at the time. They were Westbury, they were Herricks, they were all the way up here, kind of. They had the prime farmland, Jerusalem on the south shore, which is now Wantagh. They all had Quaker meeting houses. And it just seems that the cavalry was here, so they were actively making attacks around here.
That novel is it's so interesting because, as you said, it's so detailed about such a random spot. It's Long Island's occupation, and which, again, as you said, like the British didn't leave documentation, really a lot of documentation about the occupation. So where did all these stories come from? There has as you're arguing, there has to be some truth in the fiction of what was being written. So I'm guessing it's almost similar to what Underdog did, and it was kind of word of mouth, an oral history from the residents saying like these things happen, these stories, and there's probably obviously there's like it's poetic license in it somewhere, but there has to be some truth in it because there's no other sources that really show it.
What gave it away for me, Patrick, is I was reading through it, and then I read everything about. I actually thought it was real the first time.
That's what I thought too.
Right?
It doesn't give.
And then I started reading about all these people who say, "Oh no, this was a piece of art, a work of fiction." But then I said, "Hold it! They're talking about picking the officers and the soldiers. How would a person know that? I mean, unless somebody's telling them there was picketed people. I mean, another source I found says Jericho." Picking is that strange torture I was mentioning. You find all these weird things back then, where they have one arm tied. You got one arm, like one hand tied to there and one arm strapped, and your foot can only rest on a sharpened stake. They were doing this all over Hempstead in the public spaces. If an officer was caught, or not an officer, but somebody of the armed forces had broken the law, and they were associated with the cavalry, they were picketed. The article on Jericho I mentioned, I cut off the part, but it begins, and this was an account in 1790 after the war, in which the British Army was looking at the atrocities that the British had done in the war, in the military. The atrocities and how vicious it was, and they were doing a report and survey. But that account says that there was people just hanging from trees, picketing, and people would be passing by on their cart, and these guys would be hanging there, tortured, always in an orchard kind of sort. I got a story in there that I found that I don't know that anybody knew it, of gibbeting happening. Gibbeting is an iron cage. A British soldier, they couldn't figure out, Underdog couldn't figure out who it was. They found a skull encased in an iron cage. Boys dug it up in 1930 in a yard just north of Hempstead, on the outskirts of Hempstead at the time. They dug it up. They found a head in the cage, and then in the 1930s, all these archaeologists and people were looking up, who is this? Is this a murder case we don't know about? And finally, somebody found that Underdog had mentioned of this guy Silby being gibbeted, hanging in an iron cage, but he didn't know if it was military or what. So I have friends at the Loyalist collection in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I knew they had the 17th Light Dragoon muster rolls there, one of the few places in America, in North America. And I have a researcher there, she helped me, and she was really intrigued, and she didn't know what she was looking for, but I said, you gotta find this guy Silby. And she found him in the things. It said he was deceased as of that year, roughly the date. So now we know it was Robert Silby. We didn't know this before, so this is something, we know that he was a British cavalry trooper. And then they posted it on the Hempstead thing, and then other people were like on a blog there, and certain people came on. I think, Steve, you heard about the posting at Hempstead of my book, but they were talking about this gibbeting, and they found years ago a skeleton in a parking garage right downtown near the church, St. George's. But it's not that story. This was on the outskirts where you enter Hempstead, and it would be a threat to anybody entering the town that this is what happens to you, in the military if you're a dissuader or a criminal. Kind of a horror story, Halloween story for you guys. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, everybody should walk by because I'm also an artifact collector and kind of restore I've shown some pieces a couple months ago over here. Most of the buckles I brought today are troop buckles that were found on Lloyd's Neck by me in doing research. And I kind of restored them. And then there's some arms, equipment, and bottles, wine bottles, everything. So these were Loyalist troops on Lloyd's Neck. Lloyd's Neck was the British headquarters for kind of Long Island, and there was one in Southampton. So all the troops were kind of amassed there. So I have and what happened is a lot of the Loyalists from all over the East Coast of the United States started to flee because they were being attacked by townsmen and things who were against them. And they would flee and go to Lloyd's Neck, and they'd go across on the boat from Connecticut. But a lot of the Loyalists, by late in the war, 1782, 83, there was refugee camps all over Lloyd's Neck. So you can actually go in some of the ravines. I don't know how much longer things will be there. I don't think there's much, but when I started 10 years ago kind of looking for peace artifacts, you could find wine bottles broken on the surface in leaves and things, and I have some of those in a case here, you can see, and medicine bottles, and the glass is light, so the artifacts float up over the years of precipitation and water. And a little tin. There's a buckle that we think is Hessian buckle over here. I've been kind of doing some research on that. That was found in Lloyd's Neck. And near that was a number of these tin cups that are fragments, and I've been reconstructing those. So feel free to walk and look, and if you want to purchase a book, no problem. You can buy them here, or buy them at the front desk, and I'll sign it if you want. So, thank you, everybody.